I once lived in a tiny town, if you can even call it that. There were barely 200 people spread across winding back roads and wooded valleys. My cabin stood off the highway, beyond a thin patch of forest that separated me from the main route. Though I technically had neighbors, they weren't what most would call close by city standards. You might find one person half a mile away, and another nearly a mile in a different direction. Each house was hidden among the trees. I worked from home on my computer. Being out there working alone didn't bother me. I even welcomed it. My dog Shelly and I would often take evening walks among the towering pines and scrubby undergrowth to reset from the indoors. Being glued to a screen for the majority of the day called for copious amounts of coffee and the fresh outdoors. But one day on one such walk, I heard 2 sharp gunshots echo through the woods. Startled, I paused for a moment, but quickly reminded myself that this was hunting territory. Gunfire wasn't unusual, especially in a place where people prided themselves on their self-sufficiency and outback sensibilities. I shrugged it off and went about my day. The next day I was at home as usual when a dusty pickup truck rumbled up my driveway. That alone was odd. I didn't know many people here and wasn't expecting company. The driver, a man I'd never seen, rolled down his window, stepped out of his truck as he waved me over, and introduced himself as my neighbor, even though his place was easily half a mile or more away. In a slow drawl, he asked if I had heard those gunshots from yesterday. I admitted I had, and he quickly claimed someone had been firing at his house over a land dispute. He didn't ask me to be a witness, only if I'd heard anything and that it wasn't a big deal. The entire interaction felt strange, especially since I'd never met him before, and it's not every day someone casually reports a neighbor taking pot shots at their home. Things only got stranger from there. My dog had started digging in the yard, something she started doing not long after moving to the property, and the moment he saw this, his whole demeanor shifted. He snapped his attention to Shelly, calling out in a very sharp tone. When she ignored him, he began grumbling about how she shouldn't be doing that. I didn't feel the need to stop her. It was my property and it was just a little digging. She wasn't hurting anything. So then he took it upon himself to scold her directly, shouting for her to quit, which began to make my blood boil. But I clenched my jaw and remained neutral, unless things escalated further. The real turning point came when he stepped closer to her. Normally my dog is all wags and warm greetings. She only ever grows guarded if she senses a threat. So when she let out a low, warning growl and slightly bared her teeth, it shook me. Her reaction alone made it clear something was off about this man. What bothered me even more was how fixated he was on her behavior. When I thought more about it, why did it matter so much that she was digging? On my property, out here in the sticks of all places. It shifted my thoughts to something more sinister, as if he wasn't worried so much that she was digging, but of what she might be digging up. Alarm bells in my mind were ringing so loud I feared they'd become audible to the outside world. He then abruptly switched gears, asking if I owned any guns. When I foolishly admitted I didn't, he pivoted right back to my dog, proclaiming himself an expert dog trainer and insisting I come over to help cut firewood, making it a point that I should absolutely bring her. If this conversation sounds beyond unsettling and chaotic, it's because it was. We had jumped topics so quick I couldn't make sense of what was happening. His voice carried this slow, almost deliberate cadence, each word radiating an unspoken threat, while he faked a friendly smile. My skin prickled as I realized I'd just broadcasted that I had no means of defending myself. And what if the gunshots he'd mentioned were a part of something dark? Maybe he truly was worried my dog might unearth something, remains even, that he didn't want anyone finding. Soon enough, other people in town had clued me in. This guy lost his job, his wife, seemingly everything. Folks described him as volatile, someone with a frightening reputation. Everyone had a story about him, and none were pleasant. He sounded like a man who felt he had nothing left to lose, so decided to jump off the deep end. There were no neighbors within shouting distance of my cabin if something were to go wrong, and dense woods offered far too many ways for someone to approach me unseen. My only protection was a can of bear spray and a utility knife. More than once I found myself jumping at shadows, and my evening walks after work no longer felt safe. I began to recluse more and more. One particular night, my dog started growling at something outside the dark windows. Nothing I could see or hear, but that was enough for me. I locked myself in the small bathroom, the only windowless room, and sat there for hours clutching my knife and bear spray. I ended up spending the whole night in there. The discomfort of living there became unbearable, and I finally decided to up and leave. When the new landlords turned out to be equally strange, actually scheming to win over my dog for some reason so she'd stay with them, I realized this whole area had an unsettling vibe that I couldn't ignore. While they were at the market one morning, I packed up everything in my van, papers in order or not, and took off with my dog riding shotgun. I didn't look back. To this day, I still remember the tension that kept me wide awake those nights, the absolute dread that at any moment, someone, mainly the man that I bumped into, could slip through the trees and onto my property with a firearm, and I'd have no way out. It's an experience that taught me how much the environment matters and how much researching an area matters before moving. Sometimes life in a tiny town can be far more terrifying than that of a crowded city. The desert has always been my escape. There's just something about its emptiness that draws me in. It's vast, quiet, and away from everything. The kind of place where you can sit under the stars and feel like you're the only person in the world. There's a spot I used to go now and then with my dog Russ, a little patch of nowhere with an old abandoned shack and these weathered horse corrals. I don't know much about the history, or who lived there, or how long it's even been abandoned, but it's always fascinated me. The place has a quiet, forgotten feel to it, and when the gentle wind blows, it whistles almost mournfully through the old metal and wood. I'd mount the camper on my truck bed and set out there for a couple of days, explore the area during sunlight, and then come back to cool down and unwind at night. It was perfect. No one ever came out that far, especially due to the rugged roads, so I had all the solitude I could want. The sunsets out there were always unbelievable, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple, and once the stars came out, nothing could beat that view. It was a habit of mine to lock down everything, bunk down, and then leave the blinds open in the camper at night just to soak it all in. The moonlight, the stars, the openness of it all. One night, after hiking most of the day, I was completely spent. My dog and I had dinner, and I journaled for a while by the fire, before dousing it and crawling into bed. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when my dog's barking woke me. At first, it was one of those moments where it bleeds into your dream, like when your brain tries to incorporate a sound you're hearing into whatever you're dreaming about. But then I fully woke up, and I realized Russ's barking wasn't letting up. He was at the foot of the bed, fur-bristled, barking his head off in this deep, angry tone that I don't hear from him often. It took me a second to get my bearings, and when I turned toward the window, I swear my heart stopped. There was someone outside, a silhouette, human-shaped, standing there staring straight into the camper, at me. I froze. It wasn't like they were moving around or trying to get in, but I still knew this wasn't right. That camper was also built for one, and the window next to the bed was hardly a foot or two from my face. Before I could even react, they moved, and they moved fast. It was in a split second that they ducked out of sight because they knew I'd spotted them. Adrenaline hit me hard. I grabbed my gun. It's always nearby when I'm out camping, and I swung out of bed. My dog was still having a fit. Without even thinking, I threw open the camper door and stepped outside into the cool night air. The desert was still lit up by the moon, bright enough to see pretty far in every direction. It was quiet, eerily quiet, except for some soft gusts of whistling wind. It was just me, my dog in the middle of nowhere. I scanned the area with my flashlight, my heart still pounding while I attempted to register everything. The land around me was relatively flat, wide open, with mostly nothing but shrubs and a few scattered rocks. If someone had been there, I should have been able to see them running off, at least hear them. But there was no movement, no sound or anything. I walked around the trailer, my dog glued by my side, his ears still perked and his nose working overtime. With my blood still running hot, I checked the shack, the corrals, and even the edges of camp, but I didn't find a single thing. Nothing to suggest someone had been there. It didn't make sense. I kept telling myself I must have imagined it. Maybe it was just a really vivid dream bleeding into reality. But what didn't make sense is why Russ would have been barking so relentlessly. The way the shadow disappeared so quickly, like it was never there at all. And then another thought hit me. That window next to the bed where I was sleeping is about 7 feet off the ground. After a while, I regained myself and went back inside, locked the door and sat down beside Russ. He was still on edge, but I rubbed his neck and told him he'd done a good job. I kept praising him through a shaky voice while giving him some treats. He finally started to settle down and curled up at my feet, but I just couldn't relax. I sat there with the gun in my lap, listening. It was a long time before I went back to that spot. Everything about the emptiness out there is still beautiful to me, the mysteries of the desert. But sometimes I can't help but think about what, or who, might be out there watching. Camping has always been one of my favorite ways to recharge. There's something about being surrounded by the wilderness that feels grounding. You sit out there with the crackling fire in your ears, and for a while, everything else fades. My friend Casey, my dog Hazel, and I had decided to spend the weekend at a spot I'd visited a handful of times before. It was a site tucked deep in the woods, beside a narrow creek. By the time we got everything set up, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the forest bathed in dusky shades of purple and blue. The firelight danced on the bark of nearby trees, and the air smelled like pine, earth, and wood smoke. We ate our meals by the fire, talking and laughing until exhaustion caught up with us. Casey turned in early, saying she was wiped out from the hike, and after a while it was just my dog and me. Hazel lay at my feet, her head resting between two weary paws, the classic picture of calm. I stayed up a little longer, staring into the fire with a beer in my hand, savoring the peace. The stars were brighter than I'd seen in weeks, and the only sound was a soft gurgle of the creek nearby. Moments like that make you forget how much space is out there, how isolated you really are. I was in somewhat of a trance when I noticed my dog's head lift quickly from her paws, like she'd caught something I couldn't hear or see. But then her entire body lurched up, and she was immediately on guard. A low growl rumbled from her chest. It was quiet, almost as if under her breath, but enough to make me pay attention. I set the beer down and followed her gaze, squinting into the shadows just beyond the edge of the firelight. I figured it was something like a forest critter, maybe a deer, but I reached for my flashlight just in case, clicking it on and sweeping the beam across the tree line. Nothing moved. There was no rustling in the trees. It was just the forest and its shadows, shifting in the wind. I was content with my initial thought until I heard a whistle. It was faint, but unmistakably deliberate. A short, sharp note, the kind you'd use to call a dog. My blood ran cold as Hazel's growl turned into a sharp bark. Her muscles coiled like a spring, as if she were deciding whether to run or stand her ground. My heart now was pounding, and the whistle came again, sharper this time, followed by a rustling in the underbrush, as if someone or something was moving closer. Whoever was out there wanted my dog's attention, for whatever reason. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back inside the trailer. I stood slowly, keeping the flashlight aimed at the trees, and paced myself toward the door without turning my back. I didn't want my back turned on the woods. The sound of my boots crunching against the gravel felt deafening in the silence. I clucked at Hazel to get her to come in. When I finally got inside, I locked the door behind me and peeked through the small window. Casey was already rising from the bed as she heard the commotion, and I filled her in on what was going on, and if she wasn't already awake, that definitely woke her up. We stood there in the dark of the trailer listening. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves, and the fire crackled faintly as it died down. None of us slept much that night. Every creak of the trailer and every rustle of the wind set off my looming anxiety. Hazel eventually bedded down, but her ears stayed alert, and she'd occasionally pace the trailer as if doing a proximity check. By the time morning came, I felt like I had aged 5 years. We packed up everything and left not long after sunrise, Hazel sticking close by my side the entire time. I still don't know who or what was out there that night, but I do know that we were not going to take our chances. If you ever find yourself in a situation like this, or choose to venture into the wilderness alone, always inform a family member or close friend of your plans, when you're leaving, where you're going, and when you expect to return. Be sure to carry proper protection, bring essential supplies, have a solid understanding and layout of the area, and have the tools needed to handle emergencies should they arise. Lastly, if you have a furry companion venturing by your side, remember to prioritize their safety and well-being so they can do the same for you. They may just be the only thing standing between you and the unseen.